The idea that workers in the West benefit from the poverty that can be seen across what is known as the Global South, at one level seems so obvious that people would even wonder why we discuss it. After all, even the poorest sections of the Australian working class are objectively better off than millions, if not billions, across Asia and Africa in particular. We know every time we travel overseas, from Australia particularly to Asia, we know we see people whose lives are demonstrably worse than ours in terms of housing, in terms of consumer goods, in terms of the crushing workload that so many people face because of the absence of union organisation and public holidays and the like. Now, if the argument is correct that workers in the West benefit from the oppression and exploitation of the mass of the population in the Global South, then this has very important consequences. It means that logically, workers in Australia should advocate for imperialism, should advocate for the continued, in fact the greater exploitation of the Global South, because we would then benefit from that exploitation. And conversely, there's an argument that workers in the West, in industrialised countries like Australia, actually are too affluent to fight and can be part of the problem, that really the heart of any revolution will come out of the poverty-stricken billions in the Global South. Now, the argument is quite powerfully put, including by people who would describe themselves as being on the left. So, for instance, a British academic by the name of Kai Heron, who describes themselves as an eco-Marxist, put it this way: if you drink coffee in the US or Europe, or Australia for that matter, we can add, if you eat chocolate, own a phone, or wear clothes, you are in all likelihood a participant in the super-exploitation of the peripheries, lands and labour, the periphery being those countries outside of the industrialised core in the world. And Kai Heron goes on to say that solidarity with the Global South requires a degree of material sacrifice on the part of workers in the imperial core. So in other words, Australian workers benefit, in his view and the view of many others, from the exploitation of the Global South. That means that we are tied in to that process of exploitation. It means that the 100,000 Australian workers or more who have marched for Palestine over the last 15 months have actually gone against their material interests. In order to prop up our higher standard of living, we should be with Israel and imperialism against Palestine. So what is going on? Why is it that both instinctively and politically so many workers in Australia in practice go against what seems to be their common sense interests? And I think it's because that surface appearances are not enough to explain what is going on in society. As Karl Marx put it, all science would be superfluous if the outward appearance and the essence of things directly coincided. So what I want to do in this podcast is distinguish between the outward appearance, which indicates that Australian workers benefit from the exploitation, the super exploitation of our brothers and sisters in the Global South, and the essence of things. And that is, I want to argue that capitalism provides a basis, a common basis for unity and solidarity between workers in all parts of the world. You're listening to The Sound of Solidarity, brought to you by Solidarity. We're a revolutionary socialist group in Australia, and if you'd like to find out more about us, our website is solidarity.net.au. I'm David Glanz, and I'm recording this episode on unceded Wurundjeri land in Naarm or Melbourne. part of the problem is that, and this has been accepted as holy writ by some on the left, is that there is an argument coming apparently from Lenin, the Russian revolutionary, that muddies the waters. Lenin wrote a pamphlet called Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism in 1916, in the middle of the First World War. And he did so to try to explain, firstly, how the horrors of the First World War had arisen out of imperialist rivalry between Britain and Germany and France and Austro-Hungary and Russia and then subsequently the United States. That each of these imperialist powers was trying to carve out the largest possible sphere of influence, the greatest number of colonies, in order to profit from those land seizures and the domination of the people that was involved. So that was one of the reasons behind why he wrote this pamphlet. But he was also trying to explain a second phenomenon, and that was the way in which the mass parties that described themselves as socialist or Marxist that existed certainly across Europe in 1914 on the eve of the First World War, how overwhelmingly, with a very, very small number of exceptions, primarily in Russia and then in Serbia, that these parties fell in behind their own ruling classes. They advocated for the war. They supported the imposition of a tax on working class people in order for, quote unquote, their countries to win what we now know as the First World War. So this was a massive betrayal by what was known as the Second International of workers' parties, of socialist parties. In their language, in their rhetoric, they were totally opposed to the war, totally opposed to their own rulers. But in August 1914, the vast majority of both the leaders and the members of these parties collapsed into warmongering, nationalism, and a call for blood. Now, Lenin, I believe, was wrong in his explanation for what had happened. He actually said, and this is one of a number of quotes along similar lines, obviously out of such enormous super profits, he's talking about the super profits being made by the imperialist nations from what we would now call loosely the global south. Out of such enormous super profits, it is possible to bribe the labour leaders and the upper stratum of the labour aristocracy. And that is just what the capitalists of the advanced countries are doing. They are bribing them in 1,000 different ways, direct and indirect, overt and covert. So Lenin put forward the idea that there was a labour aristocracy, an upper level of the working class, including the leaders of the union movement, but also significant upper sections of the rank and file who had been bribed into supporting imperialism, who benefited from supporting imperialism and had swung over to supporting their own ruling classes. He referred to this as the labour aristocracy. And I think he was wrong in this explanation. He was right in his horror of the way in which the left parties and the union leaders betrayed internationalist principles, but he was wrong in why this came about. And I think this was because in Russia, Lenin had very little practical experience of the impact of reformism and the role of the union bureaucracy. Under the Tsarist dictatorship, really all the forces of the left in Russia, including those who would later go on to be very reformist in their practice, talked about a revolution, talked about the need to overthrow Tsarism. And unions were absolutely on the margin because of repression. There was very little scope for the union bureaucracy to play the role that they play now in so many countries around the world as negotiators between capitalists and workers, a layer of bureaucracy who have a vested interest in the continuation of capitalism because that is essentially built into their role. And Lenin was really not aware of the extent to which the conservatising role of the union bureaucracy and the growth of reformism in countries like Germany and Britain and France had rotted away the internationalist principles of the workers' movement and left some words that existed until the outbreak of the war, but in reality the core of the workers' movement had accepted the legitimacy of their nation state. Now, within 3 years, Lenin was to see a very practical rebuttal of his position, because beginning, you can say, in 1916 in Ireland, but then critically in Russia in 1917, in Germany, and waves of revolution and mutinies and upheavals that spread across the entirety of Europe with an impact much more broadly across the world. What we saw was sometimes the very same workers who had been written off as being bought off by capitalism rising up and being in the vanguard of revolution. It was some of the most skilled, most highly paid workers, for instance, in the metal industry in Russia, who were absolutely in the vanguard of the revolution, not just against the dictatorship of the Tsarist royal family, but against Russian imperialism, against the oppression of countries within and outside of the Russian Empire. So very, very quickly, this idea that workers had been bought off and therefore were now tools of imperialism rather than enemies of imperialism was destroyed in practice in that wave of revolution. But unfortunately today there are sections of the left who still take Lenin's writings as being holy writ, rather than looking at the inner essence of what Lenin was arguing about the potential for workers to overthrow capitalism. All right, that might deal with one particular argument, but it still leaves the biggest argument in play. Why is it that there is such a massive disparity in living standards between workers in Australia and the West and workers in the global South? Now, in saying this, we should not minimise the reality of poverty in Australia today. We should not accept the argument that workers here who are doing it tough with a cost of living crisis should tighten their belts as a way of expressing solidarity with those who are even poorer in Cambodia or India or the Congo. The reality is poverty in Australia today is very real and impacts millions of people. The Herald Sun in Melbourne reported just the other day that there are cancer patients who are actually not taking their medication because they cannot afford to do so and pay their mortgages at the same time. There is a growing anger amongst workers, particularly in the outer suburbs of Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane and the other major cities, who are suffering a real fall in living standards and are being squeezed in particular by enormous mortgage payments and rising rent payments. That poverty is real. But the reality is also the case that the average worker in Australia is demonstrably better off than the average worker in Laos or Vietnam. That workers in Australia, by and large, have housing, not always good, but have housing, often have cars, can afford some leisure time activities for themselves and their families. So we still have to deal with that argument. We can't pretend that's not the case. And the irony of the situation is the essence of the Marxist explanation for this massive difference in living standards actually lies in understanding the role of exploitation under capitalism. Now, exploitation in casual terms means being really hard done by a boss. A cafe worker paid below minimum wage in cash, asked to or expected to work extra hours before and after their shift. People say that's exploitation. That's outrageous, and it certainly is. But as Marxists, we understand that all workers are exploited, because when workers sell their ability to work, what is known as their labour power, to a capitalist, A capitalist takes them on in the expectation and the intention that the worker will produce more than they will get back in wages. That the worker may well cover their wages in the first 2 or 3 days of the week of turning up to work, but will keep on working even after they have produced enough to cover their own wage and their own cost of living. That is the hidden nature of capitalism, where people don't understand that on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, they're working to cover their wage. On Thursday and Friday, they're creating a surplus which their employer will seize. And after paying their expenses, that will become the profit for the capitalist. Now, the irony of the situation is that process of exploitation is actually deeper in the industrialised West, in countries like Australia, than it is in the Third World. And the reason for that is that the level of productivity is much, much higher. There is a far higher level of investment into machinery, equipment, and so on. Now, that produces its own problems for capitalism, but that's a different story for another time. But what it means is, when a worker in Australia goes to work, the amount of machinery available to them means that they will be vastly more productive than a worker who works simply with their hands in a very poor country. So a worker who breaks up stones to help make roads in India and does so by hand actually creates very little surplus. The process of exploitation is quite muted. The boss will make quite a low level of profit out of their work. In the West, you think of someone who drives one of those gigantic trucks in the mines of Queensland, South Australia, and the Northern Territory of Western Australia. Those massive trucks that can move literally multiple tons of iron ore, copper ore, coal or whatever at one time. That one worker is paid by even Australian standards a good wage. Let's say $150,000, $200,000 a year. But the amount of productivity, the amount of surplus that they're creating is vastly bigger than a worker being paid $20 or $200 in the global south. In other words, the level of exploitation in the West is greater than it is by and large in the nations of the global south. The amount of surplus production extracted from the worker by the capitalist is much greater. The profitability is greater, and therefore the ability to pay a higher wage is greater. But when that worker in driving that gigantic truck at a mine goes to work, they are producing vastly more surplus, and therefore their wage is only, even though it's big by even the standards of most of our listeners, that wage is still only a fraction of what they've produced. And that is why workers in the West are paid more, because they actually produce a much greater level of surplus and profitability for the boss. Now, obviously, these are generalities. You can find examples that puncture that argument at both ends of the spectrum. There are workers working in highly sophisticated chemical plants or oil refineries in the global south. There are workers who are doing some basic labouring work, often on their own account, who are not producing very much by the way of surplus. But that's a general pattern, that there is a mountain of capital invested in Western industrialised countries, which means workers are more productive, which means the capitalists are quite prepared to pay them more, although, of course, we always have to fight for our wage increases. We always have to fight for our days off, for our long service leave, our annual leave. But at the end of the day, the capitalists, generally speaking, can afford to pay us more, whereas in the global south, workers, by and large, produce much less of a surplus. Now, what does this mean, not just in terms of wages, but also politically? I think the most important argument is this: all workers are exploited by all capitalists. Many of those capitalists will be in the industrialised West, but many of those capitalists will also be part of the ruling class in India, in China, in Congo, in Vietnam, in Laos, and those members of the upper class also benefit from this system. So in other words, Western workers are not the ones who benefit from the super exploitation of the global south, the extractivism and the like. It is actually the Western bosses and the bosses in those global south countries. And therefore there is a material basis for workers in the West and in the global south to come together in unity. There is a material basis because we are all being exploited, even if that is very often hidden behind the differential in wages between workers in the different countries. Now you can see that, for instance, from a very early stage in capitalism. I mentioned before the Second International of Parties, the one that collapsed into warmongering in 1914. But Marx and his collaborator, Friedrich Engels, facilitated the setting up of the First International in 1864, the coming together of socialists and anarchists and labour leaders across, at that stage, Europe and parts of North America. And there was a recognition from the beginning that workers in different countries had more in common than what divided them. You know, their passports, their languages, their culture or religion, that all workers had an interest in coming together. And that was in 1864. Take, for example, Australia's richest woman, Gina Rinehart. Gina Rinehart, in April of 2024, bought an 80% stake in the Linderos copper and gold mining project in Ecuador for $186 million. So Gina Rinehart gets her profits from mining in Australia and from mining in Ecuador, and also in Chile, in Brazil and India. This is the same Gina Rinehart who in 2012 warned Australian workers that they needed to work harder to compete with Africans who were labouring for less than $2 a day. So Gina Rinehart has investments in the global south, she makes profits from them, and then she uses the lower wages that are paid there as a weapon against Australian workers. Quite clearly, Australian mine workers do not benefit by working harder to compete with low-paid African workers. Actually, Australian mine workers would benefit from wages in the mines in Africa and India, Brazil, Chile, Ecuador, going up. The only person who would lose from that arrangement would be Gina Rinehart, who may go from being the richest billionaire in Australia to being maybe a mere millionaire. So Gina Rinehart actually embodies that unity in the negative between Australian workers and workers in the global south. It is absolutely clear that Australian workers do not benefit from lining up with Gina Rinehart. They benefit from lining up with their brothers and sisters across the global south. And more broadly, this idea of common exploitation lays the basis for international struggle. Let's again go back to the 19th century because it makes it even clearer. This is in the era, of course, before the internet, before speedy international travel, between the things that we think make it easier for workers of the world unite. You can't get on a plane and be somewhere else in 24 or 36 hours in the 19th century. You can't communicate on WhatsApp or Telegram or Signal with your counterparts. The idea of global internationalism was much more abstract, but therefore much, much more powerful. Let's take Manchester. Manchester in England was the largest processor of cotton in the world at the time of the American Civil War in the early 1860s. And the American slave-holding southern states were the largest producers of cotton. So Abraham Lincoln, who was president of the US, so basically of the North in the Civil War, wanted to isolate and economically cripple the South, and he implemented a naval blockade of its cotton to make it difficult, if not impossible, for cotton to be exported to the cotton mills of Manchester and elsewhere in the north of England, and that produced great hardship for the mill workers. Supplies of slave-grown cotton from the US began to dry up, and it resulted in what became known as the Lancashire cotton famine. Lancashire is the county of England where Manchester is. Manchester's mill workers experienced a period of great hardship as mills closed and workers lost their jobs, and the British government was officially neutral. But many of the merchants and the manufacturers in northwest Britain, in Manchester, in Liverpool, prioritised wealth at home over freedom abroad, and they backed the Confederate South, the slave-owning southern states, and organised warships to support their enslavers. In other words, the British capitalists who were making profits out of slave-produced cotton were prepared effectively to step in to make sure that the slave owners continued to export and they continued to make profits. But what was the response of the mill workers? They were suffering because of a lack of cotton, but they came together in a coalition with small L liberals and slave trade abolitionists to back the North. And there was a famous public meeting at the Free Trade Hall in Manchester on the 31st of December 1862, and Manchester's mill workers resolved to endure the privations of the blockade and lend their weight to the fight against slavery. Karl Marx at the time hailed this as one of the greatest ever examples of working class international solidarity. White workers in Manchester who had never been to America, never met a slave suffering under the lash of the overseer, who had lost their jobs, who were suffering enormously, said, "We stand with our brothers and sisters in the United States, with the slaves and those fighting for their liberation in the northern states." That apparently should not be possible if you draw a line between the exploitation of the slaves and the profits of the cotton industry. But class interests, the class differential between the cotton owners and the cotton workers, was what was decisive. And look, you can see this process working through in Australia as well. The best sections of the working class, far from lining up with their bosses in order to encourage greater exploitation of people in the global south and therefore greater profits and therefore greater wages and therefore maybe a holiday home or a boat to take out on your holidays, the best workers have lined up time and time again in international solidarity. They did so, of course, famously against South African apartheid. On the wharves, the banning of South African apartheid ships, the response of workers across the country when South African rugby players came to play in Australia. There was immense international solidarity. We saw it too around Vietnam, with wharfies leading the way, placing bans on ships that were transporting weapons and goods to support the imperialist war effort in the south of Vietnam. We saw it with Timor-Leste, where in 1999 workers took action in defence of the liberation of Timor-Leste. Workers at the airports refused to work with Garuda Airlines, and other workers walked off the job. In Melbourne, there was a fantastic lunchtime rally primarily of white-collar workers, probably 20,000 strong, where people walked off the job spontaneously in order to rally for Timor-Leste in the heart of the city. And of course, not often enough, but we have seen workers line up with Palestine over the last 15 months. We have seen wharfies refused to cross community picket lines. We have seen small numbers, but significant numbers of workers walking out on strike for Palestine, particularly in Melbourne in 2024. But I want to give you one more example in summing up, which is less known, but is absolutely important for the argument. And this was around the issue of whether or not Dutch imperialism would continue to control what is now known as Indonesia. Now, logically, if workers in this country had been bought off by the super profits, they would have lined up with the Australian state, which in turn supported the return of Dutch colonialists after the defeat of the Japanese in the Pacific in mid-1945. What happened in practice was that workers stood together and defended the Indonesian liberation movement. It started yet again with the Wharfies' fantastic track record of struggle, but the bands spread very quickly to the tug workers, the boiler makers, iron workers, engineers, storemen and packers, painters and dockers, and carpenters. In September 1945, Indonesian troops mutinied and Indonesian seafarers walked off Dutch ships in Brisbane and Melbourne after discovering arms on an Indonesian-bound ship. The Sydney branch of the Waterside Workers' Union distributed flyers on Sydney wharves declaring, "The loading of these ships is a definite challenge to the democratic ideals of the Australian labour movement. To assist the Dutch in any way is to assist avaricious Dutch imperialism against Indonesian democracy." And from then on, all Dutch shipping was declared banned or black. There were bans by 31 Australian unions and 4 unions of Asian seafarers that held up 559 ships on the Australian waterfront that would have been deployed to prevent the Indonesian masses becoming independent and declaring the Republic. And the spirit of the boycott spread to Australian troops who were still stationed in Indonesia and supposed to be supporting the Dutch in restoring their colonial rule in that period after the defeat of Japan. The Communist Party of Australia had 4,000 members in the military, of whom 1,400 were in East Indonesia. They helped establish a pro-Republican organisation, a pro-Indonesian Republican organisation in the Australian Army and Air Force. And a letter signed by 80 soldiers in East Indonesia that was sent to the Waterside Workers' Union claimed, and I quote, "The overwhelming majority of our chaps have a tremendous amount of sympathy for these people here whose life is one of continuous squalor under the imperialists." In other words, put to the test, the best sections of the working class, far from lining up with the bosses for a share of the super profits, lined up with workers and peasants in the global south fighting back against imperialism. We saw it with the First International in the 1860s. We saw it with the international solidarity of the mill workers in Manchester against slave owners. We saw it again against South African apartheid, Vietnam, and more and more. And all of this lays the basis for international socialist organisation. And that is why Solidarity is proud to be part of an international grouping of revolutionary organisations, the International Socialist Tendency, which includes comrades across the global south, in South Africa, Botswana, Nigeria, Thailand, Lebanon, Kurdistan, and many others. And all of us should be inspired by the struggles that begin in the global south, the struggles in South Africa, in Kenya against a dictatorial regime, in Sri Lanka, where at least at one point the presidential regime was overthrown. We should be inspired by the way that people are resisting the dictatorship in Myanmar. We in the industrialised West can contribute solidarity to these struggles, and we can learn from these struggles. So when Kai Heron says to you and me that we should sacrifice, the response of solidarity is to say we should struggle. And that means renewing efforts to aid Palestine, to build solidarity amongst workers for action that can choke off the flow of weapons to Israel and put pressure on the Labour government to sanction the vicious, genocidal apartheid state. Our message is quite simple. It was the message of Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto in 1848, and our message today remains the same. Workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains.